She thought destroying my handmade quilt would break me, but all it did was cost her 3 times the price and her reputation in court. It all started on a crisp Saturday morning when the air smelled faintly of cedar and freshly cut grass, the kind of morning that made you want to open your windows and let in the day. And I was sitting on my porch working on the final stitches of a quilt that had consumed my life for the last 6 months. A quilt I wasn't just making for warmth, but as a family heirloom, using fabric pieces from my late grandmother's dresses, my mother's aprons, my father's old work shirts, and even scraps from the baby clothes of my children. Each piece was carefully chosen, hand-stitched, and arranged in a pattern that told the story of our family in colors and textures. And as I leaned back to admire the nearly finished work, I had no idea that my neighbor, who I had privately dubbed HOA Karen, was watching from her own porch with the expression of someone who believed my porch, my life, and apparently my quilt fell under her jurisdiction, even though my property wasn't technically within the HOA ban. She never could seem to grasp or accept. For months, she had been waging a low-grade war with me over everything from the color of my shutters to rustic to the fact that I had a small vegetable garden in the front yard, unsightly and non-compliant, and while I had learned to ignore her constant snide comments, what happened next crossed a line I could never have imagined. That afternoon, while I ran a quick errand to the local craft store to pick up more thread, I left the quilt neatly folded on a chair on the porch. I figured it was safe since my porch was covered and I'd be gone less than 30 minutes. But when I came back, I froze halfway up my walkway because the chair was empty, and there on the lawn, in a heap of colorful fabric scraps, lay what had once been my quilt, now slashed, ripped, and smeared with something dark coffee. It turned out while Karen stood at the edge of her driveway with her arms folded and that smug little tilt to her chin, as if daring me to say something. "Got rid of that eyesore for you," she said with a grin that made my stomach turn. "Doesn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic." I was so shocked I couldn't even speak for a moment, my mind struggling to process that someone could do something so deliberately cruel, and when I finally found my voice, all I could say was, "That was my grandmother's fabric," to which she just shrugged and turned back toward her house. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the shredded pieces spread out before me, and something inside me shifted from hurt to determination. I wasn't just going to let her get away with this. The next morning, I contacted the police, who came out, took statements, and even shook their heads at the sheer pettiness of it. But they told me that since it was property damage under a certain value, it would probably be handled in civil court unless I could prove it was harassment. That was all the motivation I needed. I dug through months of emails, text messages, and HOA newsletters in which Karen had targeted me, complaining about my porch decor, my mailbox, even the way I parked my car. I printed out everything, organized it in a binder, and added photos of the destroyed quilt along with receipts for the original materials and estimates of the labor value from local quilting guild members, who were furious on my behalf and more, and willing to provide written statements about the time and craftsmanship involved. By the time my court date rolled around 3 weeks later, I had a case so airtight that even the clerk at the courthouse raised her eyebrows when she saw the evidence pile. Karen, on the other hand, strolled into the small claims courtroom as if she were about to receive an award, wearing a bright red blazer and carrying a leather folder that looked more like a prop than an actual case file. She didn't even have a lawyer, which was fine by me, because I had already consulted with one who had assured me that, based on the evidence and her repeated harassment, I could argue for not just replacement value but triple damages under the state's harassment and vandalism statutes. The judge, a calm, silver-haired woman with the kind of patience that only comes from decades on the bench, listened as I laid out my case, showing every piece of evidence and explaining the sentimental value behind the quilt, while Karen tried to interrupt several times, claiming it was trash and not real art. But each time, the judge held up her hand and reminded her to wait her turn. When it was finally Karen's turn to speak, her defense boiled down to I was improving the neighborhood, which the judge visibly struggled not to laugh at. And when Karen admitted under oath that she had, in fact, taken the quilt from my porch and destroyed it, the judge leaned forward, steepled her fingers, and said, "Mrs. Collins, do you understand that you've just confessed to vandalism?" Karen blinked like she hadn't considered that her words might have legal consequences. 10 minutes later, the judge ruled in my favor, awarding me not just the cost of materials and estimated labor but triple damages for harassment and emotional distress, which came out to over $4,500, an amount that made Karen's jaw drop and her face flush a deep shade of red. As the gavel came down, I felt a wave of vindication wash over me, not because of the money, though it would certainly help me start a new quilt, but because it was official. Karen's petty cruelty had finally caught up to her. The local paper even ran a small piece about the case under the headline, "Neighborhood Dispute Ends in Triple Damages Award," which I clipped and tucked into the binder along with the court documents. Over the next few weeks, Karen's usual morning patrols around the neighborhood grew less frequent, and I started to notice that some of her own HOA board members avoided her at the mailbox, clearly embarrassed by the attention she'd brought to herself. One evening as I sat on my porch working on the first blocks of a new quilt, this one even brighter and bolder than the last, I caught her looking over from her yard, her expression tight, like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I didn't say anything either. I just kept stitching, each pass of the needle a quiet reminder that no matter how much she tried to tear down, I would keep building, piece by piece. And that, I realized, was the best revenge of all, not just winning in court, but showing her she could never unravel me the way she had unraveled that quilt.